accurate modern researchers. So all the work of these older ones has been more or less downgraded simply because it is assumed that they had not sense enough to be materialists, and that the materialism was the final proof of intelligence. Well, we're in a little bit of a bind right now on this point. We're not at all sure today that materialism is the solution of anything. It only seems to complicate things until no one can solve them. But now we go to the picture of the universe, as it was in the Nuremberg Chronicle and in early editions of astrological works which preceded Kepler and Tycho Brahe. And we find what? We find a series that looks like of interrelating circles, looking very much like the rings of a target. These rings were concentric, and in ancient times the earth was placed in the center, and around the earth in rings were the orbits of the 7 planets of that time, of which only 5 were actual planets. The Chinese had somewhat similar designs, but preferred to use squares and triangles. But this target-like solar system was the Placidian system of ancient days. It began on the face of the earth, and a ladder ascended from the surface of the earth to the extremity of the solar system, which to these people was the planet orb of Saturn. Above Saturn they had the empyreum, bordered on the inner half the world of the heavenly realms and regions, the abodes of deity. Therefore there were these 7 rings, concentric circles, ascending in order from the face of the earth, through the orbits of the moon, and then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, and finally Saturn. This was the target-like design, which for hundreds of years completely satisfied the needs of a world devoted to inward growth rather than to scientific complications. Now this target-like device, with its various rings, inspired a number of useful discoveries. Apparently it impelled Pythagoras to discover the octave, or the mystery of musical harmony. It permitted him also to discover the principal chords, and by stretching a thread or cord from the face of the earth to the upper end of the orbit of Saturn, he created a cosmic musical instrument. This has been reproduced in design and with diagrams of many values by Robert Fludd, the English Rosicrucian of the 17th century. Also, Fludd then took this design and laid it on the human body and came to the conclusion that the 7-fold division of Pythagoras was equally applicable to the physical structure of the human being, not only his composition, but his actual physical body. Little by little, therefore, this septenary system took over as a means of discovering the essential pattern behind life, to find out, if possible, what was good and what was evil, what was real, what was unreal, what was honorable, what was false. All these things were involved in the 7 deadly sins, the 7 cardinal virtues, one of which in each case was attributed to the planets. So they made a kind of moral universe by bringing all the moralities of life into the planetary structure. They also divided it into areas for continents. They divided the oceans from the land. They created the octave and set up the frets to discover the upper and lower octaves of music. They created a scale of sound, a palette of 7 colors. They developed all types of septenaries, and these septenaries are still more or less valuable. They knew the 7 senses. They also knew the 7 psychic powers of the human being. Everything was developed from a grand diagram. And when that diagram came down to us as on a flat sheet of paper, with the orbits of the planets and the elements indicated, and the empyreum or the divine realms above, the modern astronomer looked at it for a moment and said, it's rubbish. It's not the way solar is at all. This isn't it. This is pure fiction. Well, it may not be fiction, for the reason that reality may not be physical. And no matter how far we go, or how many planets or parts of the universe we discover, we may not have the answer. So instead of ridiculing this old idea, some have taken it and created from it formulas for the reconstruction of life. Now, we know that the ancient mysteries were the sacred institutions of knowledge. They were the universities. They were the gymnasium of education. They were all things to those who sought to know. So these ancient institutions accepted disciples into their structure by a system of rites or tests called initiations. And now, in most cases, these initiations were 7 in number, and they advanced from the material to the most abstract. They formed the rungs of a ladder of growth, a ladder of unfolding internal potentials. The disciple ascended the ladder by overcoming the negative attributes of each of the 7 planets. He learned how to use knowledge and not abuse it. He learned to understand the difference between love and lust. He also sought to understand the difference between education and knowledge. These things gradually developed in many countries. In Babylonia, the goddess Ishtar descends through the 7 gates to rescue the dying Attis or Adonis. The 7 different levels, like Muhammad, climbing the 7 rungs that fell from the sky, which led him up to the uppermost, and at each of the 7 gates was one of the 7 patriarchs of the Old Testament. But when he came to the 7th gate, so strangely enough, in a Muslim book, the guardian of that gate was Christ. Now all this has something to do with astronomy, because the ancient charts show these gates as parts of the orbits of the planets, the psychological universe lying behind the literal one. We find everywhere in the mysteries of Mithras, the steps. The Mithraic philosophy reached Great Britain, and there still in the great houses of parliament and law are the symbols of the ancient rites. The Templars' headquarters in London was a place of initiation with 7 steps. All of these things remind us that these steps represent qualities. These qualities each rotates around its own sun. The emotional universe rotates around the intellectual or mercurial world. Everything works in an orderly manner. Now we go into the human body, and this is what the Buddhists call the mysterious cave of 7 parts. The 7 parts are the organs of the human body recognized by the ancients. These 7 vital organs are strengthened and intensified in their functions by the contributions of 7 endocrine glands. Every part of the system works together, and to get a key to one part comes far towards opening all the rest of the mystery. We know that some of it has even reached into modern anatomy in names and words. We know about the pia mater in the brain, the thin, a gentle, a kindly mother. We know also that the upper axis of the spine, where it joins the skull, was known even in science as the pyramid. All kinds of strange things. The spinal column, with its 33 segments, still corresponding with the degrees of the ancient mystery systems. So we have all kinds of things to think about relating to this ascent from the superficial to the essential. This descent, which is a mystical experience, as John expresses it in the Revelation. The Revelation of John is almost a completely Gnostic work, dealing with initiations into the Gnostic rites. John is picked up and carried through the spheres and comes finally to the gates of the Empyrean. and there the upper world is revealed to him.